So, you're German, East German, and it's the summer of 1989. Where do you go on holiday? Why, Hungary, of course, and not just for the culture, deep-fried food, or lack of viable alternatives, but also for one other key attraction, Austria. Let's rewind a bit. Earlier that year, gentle reforms by the Hungarian government had begun, the most important of which for our purposes was the removal of the fencing between Hungary and Austria. The Hungarian government ensured that this act was made as public as possible, having electric fencing purposefully removed in front of Western film crews, and began allowing travel across the border after decades of having Western Europe completely locked off. And they even hosted a picnic to celebrate. Now you may at this point be wondering why the Soviet Union wasn't going for its usual less than peaceful response of military intervention. Well, that's because the Soviets, under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, were operating under the wonderfully named Sinatra Doctrine, which took the stance of allowing Warsaw Pact members to do it their way and make their own futures. So, whilst the Soviets weren't happy, they weren't going to intervene either. This left Hungary by themselves, and by September, the Iron Curtain had fully come down around them, which sparked thousands of East Germans packing their Trabants and flooding to the gap. After losing over 30,000 citizens, East German leader Erich Honecker realised the unfolding disaster and swiftly put an end to it by banning all travel to Hungary. Problem was, the citizens were already pretty psyched to be heading to the west, so rather than just giving up and going home, they turned their sights instead to Czechoslovakia. Although Czechoslovakia didn't actually have an open border to the west, there was still a way to get there, and that was through the West German embassies. The embassy in Prague, amongst others, became the scene of GDR citizens scaling the walls to take refuge inside and demanding passage to the west. This had been happening on and off for a few years now, and normally the refugees were granted emergency accommodation within the embassy building, but as the number of refugees grew over the course of the month to almost 4,000 people, the German Red Cross had to begin providing emergency supplies such as food, water, toilets, and beds in the embassy gardens. With so many people crammed into this small space, it quickly turned to mud, resembling other humanitarian crisis zones, such as Glastonbury. Blockades eventually prevented cars from getting too close to the embassy, with both uniformed and plain-clothed officers patrolling around the clock in an attempt to stop further would-be refugees. As a result, streets were lined with abandoned trabbies. In fact, here are just some which were recovered by the Stasi. And people got creative with their escape attempts, such as giving their luggage to Prague citizens so they could approach without suspicion and have it thrown over the wall later. These actions are remembered today through this trabby sculpture in the embassy gardens and this luggage which was never claimed. Towards the end of September, after long negotiations, an agreement was finally made between the West and the East to have the refugees be stripped of their East German citizenship and sent across the border to the West. After hours of rumours of a breakthrough, on September 30th, West German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher addressed the crowds of refugees from the balcony of the embassy in a moment which can still give you shivers to this day.
Wir sind zu Ihnen gekommen, Ihnen mitzuteilen, dass heute Ihre Ausreise
Within hours, sealed buses and trains began carrying the refugees to West Germany. But rather than go there directly, part of the deal was the brilliant idea that they must pass through East Germany. Honecker planned to use this as an opportunity to humiliate the traitors and make an example of them. But what actually happened was the refugees began throwing their torn up GDR papers out the window like confetti, and when the train stopped in Dresden, large crowds attempted to storm the station and jump on the trains, some of whom succeeded. So that went well. With all borders closed, public protests, and no sign of support or reform, Honecker was eventually ousted by his own party members, who quickly attempted to rescue the situation by reopening the borders. But following the pattern of great decisions, this just takes us back to where we started, with everyone going to Hungary, and by this point it wasn't even summer. Schools and factories closed all over the country because everyone had left for the West, which wrecked the already struggling economy, and this continued for weeks until one final confused decision was made on November 9th, when government spokesperson Gunter Schabowski read aloud a note at a press conference stating that East German citizens could apply for travel and emigration permissions to the West. Applications were only meant to be open from the next day, but Schabowski had missed the meeting where the details of the note were clarified, So when asked when this came into effect, he said,
Das tritt nach meiner Kenntnis ist das sofort. Unverzüglich. Also doch, ständige Ausrichtung können über alle Grenzübergangsstellen der DDR zur BRD bzw. zu Berlin-West erfolgen.
Yeah, there was no coming back from that one really. And within hours, crowds were gathering on both sides of the Berlin Wall with the border guards, who didn't know what had been happening on the news because they'd been at work, attempting to stall for time. Luckily, rather than things turning violent, one officer, Harold Jäger, disobeyed his orders and began letting the crowds through, effectively opening the border and ending the crisis.